Welcome to SPO104 Anatomy. Today we're going to talk about the shoulder complex in a bit of detail. And I think when you start to study the shoulder and start to look at the anatomy in a little bit more detail, it's quite often better to think of it in three main areas. So those three main areas are the global mobilizers of the upper limb, and you know from previous videos that we refer to this whole unit as the upper limb. So we're looking at the global mobilizers of that. We're looking at the stabilizers of the shoulder, which effectively means the stabilizers of the scapula. And then we look at the intrinsic muscles of the glenohumeral joint, which are the dynamic stabilizers, often also known as the rotator cuff. Now, the shoulder joint itself, the glenohumeral joint, is only one of the joints of the complex. The complex is in fact made up of 5 separate joints. 3 of them are genuine joints and 2 of them are what is known as pseudo joints. Now they're just sort of pretend joints, but they do form a kind of articulation. The genuine joints are the sternoclavicular joint, which is right here where the clavicle articulates with the sternum, in fact more accurately the manubrium. There's the acromioclavicular joint, which is often injured, commonly in sport, and is the focus of much attention when it's really badly separated, and quite often you'll see a very marked step on presentation. And the glenohumeral joint, the ball and socket, the synovial ball and socket itself, which has a fairly loose baggy capsule and sacrifices its stability for a very large range of movement. The other 2 joints in the shoulder complex are the scapular thoracic joint, which is not a genuine joint, but is the scapula held in position over the rib cage by virtue of the fact that it has stabilizing muscles, and the subacromial joint, which again is not a synovial joint, but it's just an approximation of the head of the humerus with the underside of the acromion process. So today's video we're going to look in more detail at the global mobilizers of the glenohumeral joint, in fact the global mobilizers of the upper limb, because some of those muscles actually cross the shoulder and the elbow, and so they are biarticular. So if I jump into complete anatomy, now all students have access to complete anatomy through their university account. So you can replicate most of what I'm demonstrating today. So I'm just going to strip away a couple of the layers because we don't want all of these layers on top. For example, the Platysma muscle on top there is really a muscle that we're too concerned about when it comes to the shoulder joint. Yes, it's attaching around about the clavicle, but actually is more associated with its use as perhaps an expression muscle, and also just tensing the skin up under the chin. So we'll remove that completely. First muscle to look at is this large muscle at the front, which is the Pectoralis Major muscle. Pectoralis Major has broad origin across the clavicle for the upper fibers, through the sternum and down through the abdominal fascia. Now Pectoralis Major has a number of actions that it can contribute to, and you can see there's a sort of fold in the muscle. So it actually, once the fibers are completely straightened, the shoulder or the upper limb actually is extended above your head, and that means it has quite a strong pull in a downwards direction, as well as being able to pull the humerus and the upper limb across the body. So if we look at the motions of this, you can see it's active in all of those phases, which is unusual because we're coming into adduction and across, and then back into adduction. So we're using it in flexion, slightly in shoulder depression. It works in partnership with its partner Pectoralis minor, which is just hiding behind there attached to the coracoid process, and shoulder adduction, and there it is, pulling the shoulder in from an abducted position. So that's Pectoralis Major. I will hide away that just now. We've got the deltoid here. Now you're probably familiar with the deltoid muscle, and if I just do a little bit of rotation here, you can see the deltoid muscle actually has a number of different fibers, posterior fibers there, anterior, middle fibers, and at the front the anterior fibers. And they all have a slightly different action, and that makes sense if you look at the angle of pull. So a very quick demonstration of the movements here. If you like, a little bit of medial rotation. Transverse adduction. And shoulder flexion. Looking at the acromial part of the deltoid muscle, or the middle fibers. Looking at the motion here, limited to abduction of the shoulder. And if we look at the posterior fibers, let's move my model over. Posterior fibers, lateral rotation, shoulder extension, and moving very much into hyperextension, and transverse adduction. So other muscles that work across the glenohumeral joint include the Biceps Brachii, and we've got the long head of the Biceps Brachii, and you can see the long head actually tracks over the top of the glenohumeral joint, and the short head which originates on the coracoid process of the scapula. If I was move the model slightly, you get to see the common insertion point for those two heads, which is down here. So actions for the short head include shoulder flexion, forearm supination, which is actually not easy to see in that, but you can see it working there. When you're in a pronated position, it will act together with supinated muscle to supinate. And of course the one that you're more familiar with, which is elbow flexion. Long head, she has a lot of these actions, so we've got shoulder flexion, forearm supination just as before, and elbow flexion, where it joins short head. Okay, so let's look around the back, and at the back we have the triceps muscle. We've got the long head, we've got the lateral head, and hidden underneath is the medial head of triceps. So triceps, 3 heads, biceps, 2 heads. So you can see that the long head of triceps actually attaches away from the humerus, whereas the lateral and the medial head attach to the humerus. So let's just look at the different actions. So long head is involved in shoulder extension and hyperextension, and is also involved in elbow extension. Whereas if we were to look at the, just go back a second, if we look at the lateral head in isolation and look at the action of this, it's restricted to elbow extension. and we go to the medial head. Once again, limited to elbow extension. So far we've looked at the Pectoralis Major, the deltoid, the biceps muscle and the triceps muscle. So let's hide some of these muscles and see where we are. So at this point, in terms of muscles that actually cross the glenohumeral joint and mobilizing the upper limb, we're now left with this one muscle here, which is the Coracobrachialis muscle. So Coracobrachialis is a long thin muscle attached to the coracoid, originates at the coracoid and inserts down here at the medial epicondyle. If we look at the motion of that, we've got shoulder flexion, you can see just underneath. And we've got shoulder adduction, so bringing it from an abducted to an adducted position. The anterior muscles are pretty much taken care of in terms of the mobilizing the upper limb, or the global mobilizers of the upper limb. It's just worth moving around the back because there are two more muscles which work across and help the upper limb movement. These are Teres Major muscle and Platysma muscle, which is a very broad, very strong muscle. So let's just look at Teres Major to begin with. Teres Major is involved in shoulder extension. You notice it's attached to the scapula, so quite active in the final stages there, but it's more of a contributing muscle. It works in shoulder adduction from an abducted position. Again, is bringing the humerus back towards the scapula. And is involved in medial rotation, because unusually it travels through the axilla, through the armpit, and attaches on the anterior side. So it's actually involved in pulling the humerus around into medial rotation. Teres Major itself really relies on good scapular stability to have a genuine contribution to upper limb movement. Platysma dorsi is a very strong muscle and a very large muscle, very broad sheet right across the back, and you can see it sort of rotates and those fibers turn and attach at a similar position to Teres Major, which is there, and Platysma dorsi is there. And we'll just look at the motion of that. So we have a little bit of scapular retraction so long as the upper limb is fixed. We've got some scapular depression working with teres minor at the front. It will contribute to medial rotation because of its common attachment with Teres Major. Shoulder adduction from that abducted position, and shoulder extension and hyperextension. Platysma dorsi is functionally very active in a very good swim stroke. So if you think of a front crawl, freestyle kind of swimming action, the catch initially from the hand is then powered by the down the body, through the body, pushing the body through the water, powered by the Platysma dorsi. So if we hide Teres Major and we hide Platysma dorsi, you'll see that we now have no global mobilizers attached to the upper limb. The only muscles left that we haven't discussed, which we'll save for a separate video, are the rotator cuff muscles, which are the dynamic stabilizers of the glenohumeral joint. Whilst they do contribute a small amount to upper limb movement, their attachment and the way that they are patterning is more associated with dynamic stabilization. And we'll look at that in a different video. Thanks for listening.